we had a bunch of noisy, screamy kids from 4th grade. Now I actually can talk to adults who actually know history and appreciate it. And when I was looking around, I thought, wow, there's like 3 or 4 people out here who wrote books that I've read. So this is like heaven for me. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of being here. I'd like to thank you for just having me do this program. It was really fun for me because I got to do a lot of research on stuff that I didn't even know before. In the process of researching this, I found out that there was a terrorist in England during the war, and I actually found a way to connect the mutiny on the Bounty with the American Revolution. But that's getting ahead of myself. That's the teaser to make you listen to the rest of the program. But let's go back to the very beginning and start off. A lot of people, when they think of the American Revolution, think of it in very simple terms. They don't think of the world. They think in terms of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They think of Trenton, Declaration of Independence, Yorktown, and then they're done. That's the extent of, I'm afraid, a lot of the visitors' knowledge when they come here. Or you get another aspect where people have a sort of a local perspective. Tom Winslow, who's here on our staff, he and I got to go to a conference a few years ago down in Philadelphia. We went on a bus tour, and they took us to Brandywine, Fort Mifflin, and Germantown. And we were fascinated to find in every one of these places, the staff told us that that battle was the turning point of the Revolution. When we got to the third stop, I finally asked, but didn't we lose all of those battles? They're all what we fought so well. So anybody ever asks, the turning point of the war is whatever site you work at. Now in relation to that, again, the local perspective, I'm going to give you a bit of poetry, just to add a little bit of highbrow culture to my talk here. Some of you may recognize this phrase. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flagged April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot around the world. Yeah. When I used to read that when I was in college, it's like, oh, poetry, so pretentious. But technology, I'm so good with it. It's actually sort of true when you think about it. Now that's sort of a bizarre picture. I'm trying to figure out why it's there. But here's the interactive part of the program. When you were a kid, you probably threw a rock in a nice still pond, and suddenly those ripples just started to spread and spread and spread. Here we got a rock that seems a likely candidate. Got to be able to catch. Somebody throw your hands. There, I threw my rock at the pond. Now if you look at that rock, it's a globe. It's a globe, it's a replica of the globe, obviously I wouldn't throw a real one. But that's a replica of the globe from the 1740s, it's a French globe. And you can pass it around so everybody can get a look at it. But by throwing that rock, or in this case the globe into the pond, the effects spread out across the pond. So this shot heard around the world, this little fight here, eventually spreads its effects all over the world. And that's what our program is going to be about today. I'm sure some of you have probably gone on those European tours where you do like 8 countries in 7 days. When I started researching this, my pile was this big. And over the past week, it's like I've been trying to knock it down because they told me only 45 minutes. So we're going to travel all around the world, but forgive me, I'm going to skip a bunch of countries, and we're going to keep it pretty simple just so we can get all the way through the program. Now, my boss is back there, and he's trying to teach us all sorts of interpretive things. So I'm trying to make things simple. Now, in interpretive world, they say you have to have themes. I like the idea of big ideas. And just so you know, here are the big ideas that you'll see scattered throughout the program, so you can search for them as we go along. Trade, not only commerce, but somebody's job. Territory, taxes, revenge, and they all come down to one thing, self-interest. Or as when my daughter was very young, we used to say her main theme was, it's all about me. And we're going to find that as we go through this program. So we're going to begin our tour at the end of the 7 Years' War in England, or Great Britain. The end of the 7 Years' War, or as we here call it the French and Indian War, or as friends of mine in the reenacting world call it the Frog and Savage War. England comes out the winner, and they gain lots of territory, and they end up with some problems. One is debt. That war cost a lot of money, so you got to pay off all the people you go. And how do you do that? Taxes. Then you've got all this new territory, but you have to control the expansion into it because the people who live there already, the Native Americans, don't necessarily like you moving in. Then you've got to send British troops to protect the frontier and to keep the peace, because there's another problem. One of the big companies in England, the big trading companies, the British East India Company, they need propping up. That's something we've heard recently in the news, propping up companies. And to help prop them up, they passed an act about tea, and you know all about that. So all these new problems crop up, but other interesting things are happening. Here this war is brewing, but there's a lot of Americans who are actually going to England. Now, why would Americans be going to England? They're going there because it's the cultural center of the world. Some of you are probably familiar with this picture. It's the death of General Wolfe. Again, the end of the French and Indian War. It was painted by Benjamin West. He was a gentleman from Pennsylvania. He goes to England to study art, and he eventually becomes the founder of the Royal Academy. And he becomes the center that every other American artist goes to learn more about painting, to make connections. So there's almost a whole American school in England, and we have a few other Americans who travel over there as well. Not Paul Revere, of course, but the man who painted the painting, John Singleton Copley. He was from Massachusetts, and he actually leaves Boston because he doesn't like all the revolutionary stuff that's going on. And of course, for painters, England's a place you're going to find a lot more commissions and make a lot more money. Then we've got Charles Willson Peale. You're probably familiar with his many paintings of Washington. He studied with West as well in England, but he does come back to America. In fact, he serves in the militia during the early part of the war. Later on, he actually rents space at Independence Hall and makes it into a museum where he displays a lot of his paintings. Then you've got the famous painting of the Declaration of Independence done by John Trumbull, son of the governor of Connecticut. He actually, for a very brief period, was aide-de-camp to George Washington, and he studies in England as well. He gets in trouble, though, when he goes to England. When he got there, it was after the Arnold treason and the execution of Andre. The British weren't really pleased, so they actually jailed him. And he's only got out of jail because of the influence of West, and he has to agree to leave the country immediately. So he comes back to America. But then he does a series of historical portraits later on. If you go to the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, you'll see those portraits or paintings there. Then, from our own collection, if you go right across the hallway over to that room, Patience Wright, a woman from New Jersey. She becomes a widow, and to support her family, she starts doing sculptures out of wax. She set up a wax works in New York City, the early Madame Tussauds. Then she goes to London and actually becomes so famous she becomes friends with the King and Queen of England. She actually called them by their first names. But she apparently was also very vocal about the American cause, so that she sort of fell out of favor. There's even rumors that she put spy information inside wax busts, but I don't know about that part. But this is a photo of one that's actually in our collection just across the hall. Then, who could forget George Washington with the dollar bill? Done by Gilbert Stuart, and we have a copy of Stuart's portrait upstairs as well. Stuart left Boston just before the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he doesn't come back to America until after the war. So you've got all these Americans when all this war is brewing, and they're going over to England. But at the end of the French and Indian War, you also have lots of Americans coming here, a lot of guys who would later on become famous generals, and actually be down in Jockey Hollow, guys like General Hand, General Irvine, Arthur Sinclair. So there's a cross sort of travel. So we've got to keep moving and get out of England. We'll come back to England at the end. Basically, we're going to go all the way around the world, come back to England again, and then finish up in France. So as you can tell, we've got a long trip. So we head over to Europe, and now we come over to France. France was the loser at the end of the 7 Years' War, and they lose all of Canada, and they're not very happy. So their big thrust looking towards England is revenge. They want to get even. They want to make England suffer. So when the war breaks out, they secretly start supplying us with all sorts of munitions, loans of money, uniforms, and then when the war is officially declared between England and France in 1778, they continue to support us. Now, when you look at it from an 18th century perspective, it's sort of odd that Catholic France, who America had been fighting for centuries, suddenly become allies. But it comes down to that old expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They want to make England suffer, so that's why they get into war. They're a monarchy. They don't want to support the uprising of the little people, but they want to make England lose. So revenge is their big goal. The French, of course, give us lots of assistance, and we're lucky because after they lose the French and Indian War, they want to revamp their military and their navy, so they start building new ships, they start coming up with new weapon systems. So they have a lot of war surplus stuff that they can send to us, so we benefited the resulting of that. They also send over trained officers and eventually troops. And moving a little bit south, we come to Spain. Spain was also a loser in the 7 Years' War. They lose some territory. They get some of the return that they had lost. Their empire at this period is worldwide. They have territory in Central America, South America, North America, the Philippines. They're all over the place, but their empire is sort of on the decline. Their big interest in getting the American Revolution is Gibraltar. They lost that at the beginning of the 18th century and they want it back. And if you've any your geography books lately, they still don't have it. But they really tried during the war. That's one of their biggest goals, is they want to get Gibraltar back. They're also interested in acquiring other territory. But when the war starts between France and England, they laid siege to Gibraltar for 3 years. And as you know, they still don't have it. The Spanish also do provide us with some aid, not on the same level as France, but through New Orleans, they're sending supplies up to us, and they're involved as well. One of the things they do achieve is just off of Spain, the island of Minorca, they do capture that during the war. That was one of their goals. Minorca was a deep water port, and it was being used by English privateers, so they wanted to get rid of that threat. Then we've got the Netherlands, or Holland. They, at the time, were the biggest trading country in the world. They were one of the biggest banking nations in the world. So they're more interested in trade when the war breaks out. They don't really want to get involved. They're just staying neutral and trying to trade with everybody if they can. They have a trading company. A lot of these countries don't necessarily go into another land and set up shop themselves. They have a private company that does it. So there is the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, on and on and on. And their East India Company has outposts in Africa, India, Ceylon, the Spice Islands, China, and Japan. As I said, they're trying to remain neutral, but England, through earlier treaties, wants them to get involved on the English side. One of the things I was surprised to find out was that the English, because of prior treaties, actually asked the Dutch for troops when the war breaks out. And they're not Dutch troops. They're Scottish troops that the English have been loaning to the Dutch for a long time. So they're basically asking for their own guys back. But the Dutch don't really want to get involved, so they keep putting it off and putting it off. Some of the books said that that was actually an English excuse so they could hire more German troops. The Dutch are doing a lot of trade with America through an island in the Caribbean called St. Eustatius. That'll come up later in our talk. Eventually, the Dutch are getting worried about the English, so they join what was called the League of Armed Neutrality. And we'll talk more about that later on. But finally, in 1780, in December, England gets fed up with Holland, with the Dutch, and they declare war on them. And then that's an immediate opportunity for England to attack any Dutch settlement they can find, and they can acquire more territory. The Dutch do, at the end of the war, provide John Adams with a loan for America of $2 million for war supplies. And then you've got all the Germans. Now, there's no one big Germany at this time, lots of little kingdoms. And that's where the English go hunting for troops. Eventually, they get troops from 6 different nations. Eventually, they get over 30,000 troops from Germany. A lot of people always harp on the fact that they're mercenaries. Oh, the German troops are bad because they're mercenaries. The troops themselves have no say in it. They're not making any great profit from it. It's their prince who's renting them and getting a rental fee. He's getting money, in some cases, if his subjects, his soldiers are killed. So they're not mercenaries in the bad sense you might think of. If you want to think of mercenaries, it's more of all these foreign officers who come over. So like Baron von Steuben, he's a mercenary. Pulaski, Kosciuszko, all those kind of guys. But the Germans have lots of troops that they can send over, and they do come. The biggest military state in Germany, Prussia, refuses to send troops. Frederick doesn't want to get involved. Later on, he joins the League of Armed Neutrality. With all these Germans coming over, the Americans try to subvert them. They encourage the German troops to desert. They actually promise them land if they desert. They actually print up propaganda leaflets in German and sneak them into German camps and spread them around. One of my favorite stories is there were German troops who had been captured at Saratoga. They're called the Convention Army. And they were being held outside Boston and Cambridge early in their years as prisoners. And the Americans actually get a German soldier from another prisoner of war camp. They put him in a really fancy carriage, they give him a really fancy uniform, they get two really pretty girls that sit him on either side of him, they give him a bunch of booze, and they drive him outside the prison camp, and he stands up and goes, "Hey guys, look how good things are." The Germans who were captured in Trenton, Washington made sure that they were treated as best as possible because they knew they were going to be exchanged and sent back, and when they get back they could tell all their comrades how nice the Americans were to them. So they're doing a lot of encouraging of Germans to stay put or get out. In fact, a lot of German prisoners of war were actually allowed to be hired by businesses to work for them. How many people here from Morris County? Raise your hand. See, it's audience participation. Ever hear of Mount Hope? Picatinny Arsenal? John Jacob Fage? He hires German prisoners of war to work as woodcutters up in Mount Hope. When the war ends, they were supposed to go back, but a lot of them would face money. So he wouldn't let them leave until the German government actually paid to buy their guys back. But a lot of those German prisoners had found local women that they married, and a lot of them stay. So a lot of the German troops never go back to Germany. I mentioned propaganda a minute ago. There's a lot of interesting stories about people from foreign countries who, most people in those days didn't travel. You probably never left your own county. So suddenly when you encounter these strange people, you have these strange ideas about them. There's a diary of a German surgeon who was with the German troops get captured at Bennington. And since he's considered a gentleman, an officer, he's not thrown in a prisoner of war camp, he's just held in homes in Massachusetts. And they keep moving around. When he's first captured, he doesn't speak English, he speaks German and he speaks French. And he notices something odd when he goes from town to town, but he can't find anybody that speaks German or French to find out what's going on. Finally, after about the third or fourth town, he finds somebody who's an educated man who speaks French, and they start talking. And the German surgeon turns to the man and says, "You got to explain something to me. Every town that I've gone to, when we get there, I see everybody taking their children and hiding them. What's the story?" And the man said, "Well, we were all told that the German soldiers eat babies, so we have to hide our children." And it's funny, you find all these kind of stories occurring with lots of different countries. There's another story where there were French officers who come over to America to serve in the American Army, and they're staying in a common farmer's home. And in the morning, they're in the kitchen. And the farmer comes down to the kitchen, and he brings out a bowl of water, and he brings out some soap, and he brings out a razor and a towel, and he looks at this French gentleman, this officer, and says, "Well, I'm ready now." And the officer looks up and says, "Ready for what?" And he goes, "Well, I'm ready for you to shave me." And he looks up, "Why would I shave you? I don't shave myself. My servant shaves me. I can have him shave you if you want, but why do you think I should shave you?" "Well, you're French, aren't you?" "Yes." "Well, we heard all Frenchmen were barbers." So, moving on. We're going to go to Russia next. Russia was a vast land, and they're trying to get more and more influence in Europe. They're trying to stay neutral. That was actually one of the first countries England goes to try to hire troops to send to America. They thought Russian troops would be wonderful, because there's no Russians living here. The Russians won't speak English. It'd be really hard for them to desert like the German troops do. But Catherine the Great refuses to send any troops. She's trying to stay neutral as much as she can. Catherine is the one who actually starts the League of Armed Neutrality. She's so concerned with trade. And what is interesting, one of her cargoes is actually stopped by the Americans. They had a Russian cargo on a British ship. American privateers stop it because it's a British ship, but the cargo is supposed to be Russian, but they take everything, and she gets really mad. So she wants to protect both sides in terms of commerce. So she forms what's called the League of Armed Neutrality, where they were for free trade, and they actually made threats that they might go further if their trade's interfered with. Originally it's Russia, Denmark, and Sweden. Later on, Prussia, Portugal, Austria, and the Netherlands all joined in the League. Then, we got to get moving, so we're going to skip a bunch of countries, and we're going to come to Africa. At this time, Africa is a place on the west coast of Africa. They're doing a lot of trading, and for the trade to the Indies, they're making a journey all the way around Africa. So the islands over there to the west off of the Big Hump are a stopping off point to get more supplies and water. The Cape of Good Hope, or as we now call it, South Africa, is another stopping off point. When the Dutch finally get in the war, the English immediately want to attack Dutch settlements, particularly the Cape of Good Hope, because that's a great stopping off place for your navy. And they actually sent ships down to the Cape Verde Islands, heading down to the Cape of Good Hope. But a French fleet happens to run into them by mistake there, and they fight a battle and they drive them off. So the French actually saved the Cape of Good Hope for the Dutch. West Africa, of course, all the European countries have trading posts there. The Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, the Danes, and they're trading for gold, ivory, wax, amber, and of course slaves. And of course, different parts of that coast were actually designated by what they traded. The Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast. When war breaks out with the European countries, they start knocking off each other's territory. The French take Senegal from the British. The British capture a number of Dutch forts. The Dutch capture one of their own forts. So it's trading back and forth. We're also going to jump ahead outside the sphere of the war, but just because it's related. At the end of the war, Sierra Leone, out there on the big hump, becomes a place where, strangely enough, African Americans end up going back to. When the war starts, the British try to discourage, or encourage, I should say, slaves, American slaves, to run away from their masters. But of course, only if you're a patriot. They don't want to have slaves run away from loyalist masters, just patriot masters. But they offer them freedom. Lord Dunmore does that in Virginia. General Clinton later on does it midway through the war. So a lot of slaves are fleeing to British lines. When the war ends, they're not going to go back to their old masters, so they become like other loyalists. They become refugees. A lot of them end up in Canada. Some end up in England, just like the regular loyalists. But when they get to places like Halifax, they find out that racial prejudice exists there too, and they're not very comfortable. So they actually petition to be sent to Sierra Leone, and a colony is set up in Sierra Leone. But it's run by a trading company, and they don't always get along there. One of the people who actually ends up there is a gentleman named Harry Washington. And the reason he's got the last name Washington is he used to be a slave of George Washington. He ran away at the beginning of the war, went to Lord Dunmore. He ends up in a unit called the Black Pioneers. He ends up in Canada, ends up in Sierra Leone. When he's in Sierra Leone, he's so upset about the way that the company is running things, he agitates and he's trying to get independence for the blacks who settled in Sierra Leone. The company doesn't like it, so he gets exiled. And the new place he sets up, he becomes a community leader there. Moving along on our trip, we come to Asia. Of course, the big attraction in Asia for Europeans is trade. Trade with India, trade with China. India has all sorts of great things that the Europeans want. It's got cotton, it's got saltpeter, which is used to be made into gunpowder, it's got diamonds, ivory, and something called opium. Opium turns out to be really good for the British because they can use that in trade with the Chinese later on. Of course, all these European settlements in India are these different trading companies. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Danish East, and so on and so on. When the war breaks out between the European powers, the British try to drive the French out of all the posts they have, and they're successful early on in 78 and 79. But they also run afoul of the actual natives who live there, and they side with the French. So they become involved. So there's these huge battles involving sepoys, Mysores, the French, the Dutch get involved as well. So there's all sorts of fighting going on in various coastal ports around India. There's naval battles off the coast of India. And Ceylon, the big island just to the south and off to the right of India. That had been a Dutch trading area where they were exporting cinnamon. And the British captured the major seaport there in 1782 in January. The French captured it back in 1782 in August. And then the French defended against another attack. So at the end of the war, it's the control of the French and they give it back to the Dutch. Further south and to the right, you come to Indonesia, Sumatra, the East Indies, the Spice Islands, places that provide such things as pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and other spices. The Dutch were the primary people in control of trade there, though the British have outposts there as well. And here's where the news that comes fast is the best. News traveling about, wars broke out between the English and the Dutch doesn't travel very quickly, especially halfway around the world. So whoever gets the news first is the best off. So when the news of the war comes, the English find out first.
And they immediately go and attack one of the Dutch trading posts, and they're not ready, and they basically control that area. Occasionally, I come up with characters like Harry Washington. There's another interesting character for this area. There's a guy named John Blatchford. He was from Massachusetts. When the war starts, he's about 15 years old, and he becomes a cabin boy on a U.S. Navy ship. And they're out patrolling, trying to capture enemy ships, but their ship gets captured. He's first held in the West Indies, then he's held in Canada, then he's sent to England, and then they put him on a British East Indiaman, and he gets sent all the way to Sumatra. And when he gets there, he's told, you're now going to be in the British East India Army, and you're going to work here. He tries to escape, and they capture him, and as punishment, now they make him work in the pepper groves, picking pepper. He escapes again. And it's a big island, so he's actually walking around for a couple of months until he gets to a place where he can get his ship out, and he makes a journey eventually all the way back to the West Indies. When he gets there, he gets on a ship, a French ship, that's going to take him to Philadelphia. On their journey, though, the French ship gets captured. So he gets thrown into the prison ship Jersey in New York. Then the war ends, so he gets exchanged. But since he was on a French ship, he's considered a French prisoner of war, so they send him to France. Then he gets a boat back and ends up in Massachusetts, and he was away from home for 6 years. So there's a poor American prisoner of war all the way in Sumatra when the war's going on. Heading up the coast, of course, you come to China. China has all sorts of great products the Europeans and the Americans want. Porcelain, silk, and of course, best of all, tea. Tea is the British East India Company's biggest import. But there's a problem. Chinese got all this great stuff that we want, but we don't have anything the Chinese want. They're an advanced country. They don't really have anything we need. The only things they're really interested in are silver and furs. So that's about the only thing that we can trade with them until the English really start bringing in lots of opium. The Chinese know it's bad, they make it illegal, but through back channels, let's face it, the English are drug dealers, and they're bringing that in, and that's how they're making their money. But the British East India Company, who's in charge of all this trade, has a problem. They're near financial collapse at the beginning of the war. By a contractual agreement with England, they have to pay the British government £400,000 a year. But in India, there had been a famine, crop failures, markets in Europe aren't doing too well, so they asked the British government to bail them out. And the British government passes something called the Tea Act, which makes British East India Company tea really cheap, but it also reinforces one of the taxes that they want to put on us. And of course that leads to protests from the Americans, not because of the cheap tea, but because of the whole principle of the tax. And you have the various tea protests. You're all familiar with the Boston Tea Party. Every major city where they try to import tea, the Americans try to prevent it. I'm sure many of you, since you're all Jersey folks, you know about the Greenwich Tea Party. It was tea that was supposed to go to Philadelphia. They know they can't land it there, so they drop it off in Greenwich, New Jersey, and the Jersey guys there get it, they burn it. So all because of a bailout for a European company. Japan's not getting involved in anybody, then they're isolationists, so we're just going to skip that. The Philippines, it's Spanish territory, and it's how Spain makes their trades with China. Remember I said the Chinese want silver? Spanish in South America got lots of silver. So it's this enormously convoluted group where from Bolivia you get silver. You ship it up to Acapulco, Mexico. Once a year it goes by galleon all the way across the Philippines. Chinese traders come over to the Philippines. They get silver, the Spanish get tea and everything else they want. Then that galleon goes from Manila all the way back to Acapulco. Then by land it goes overland to Veracruz. Then it gets on a ship and goes all the way to Spain. But that's their empire. So the Philippines at this point is a trading port. And the Spanish, when the war breaks out, they're afraid that the British are going to come capture the Philippines because they captured Manila during the French and Indian War. So they actually send ships from Mexico to the Philippines to help protect the Philippines. So something's going all that distance. Then, time for another picture. Australia. Australia was vaguely known. If you look on the globe, it's still passing around. Parts that look real distinct, parts that don't. The Dutch had discovered northern and western Australia. Captain Cook is the one who actually explores eastern Australia. He made 3 big trips through the Pacific in the 18th century. His first was from 1768 to 71. He went to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus, which would allow them to figure out by map the distance of the sun. He also circumnavigates New Zealand. 1772 to 75, he's going as far south as he can, trying to discover the mysterious southern continent. Europeans at the time knew there was all this landmass in the northern part of the hemisphere, so they figured there had to be something down south to balance it out. So they're going all around trying to find it. So he actually circumnavigates Antarctica and doesn't find any southern continent. Then from 1776 into the period of the war to 1780, he's again exploring all over the Pacific, but he's looking for the Northwest Passage. So you could get from the Pacific all the way to the Atlantic. So he's going up around the Pacific Northwest. I love to tell Australian visitors when they come to visit us here that the reason they're there is because of us and our revolution. Because America, before the revolution, was a place that British convicts were sent to. When we revolt, can't send convicts to America anymore, so where do they send them? Australia. And the first fleet that goes over is actually called the First Fleet. And the first fleet had some Americans on it. There was a gentleman named Caesar. He was a runaway slave who ran away from George Washington. He goes to New York, and then he's evacuated to England. He's about age 14 at this time. And unfortunately, Caesar, he gets on the wrong side of the law. He gets arrested, and he gets transported all the way to Australia. Unfortunately, he doesn't mend his ways when he's in Australia. He starts stealing again. He gets punished. He runs away. Aborigines actually send him back. He escapes again, gets sent back again, and they're finding out that doesn't work too well. So Australia actually has another penal colony that they send the really bad people to, so he gets sent to Norfolk Island. When he's there, he escapes, and he leads a gang of criminals until he gets killed by Peppermint. There's another guy in with the First Fleet, and that's an American named John Nagle. He was from Pennsylvania, and he was actually at the Battle of Brandywine, but then he joins on a privateer. And when he's on the privateer, he gets captured. He ends up, through convoluted means, being a prisoner of war on the British side, and then he ends up being sent to a British ship. He joins the British Navy, and he actually is with the First Fleet when they take the convicts to Australia. Now we're going to venture across the Pacific Ocean, and we come to the lovely island of Tahiti. It was discovered by the French. Captain Cook visited there to observe the transit of Venus. But we're going to go a little bit after the war. When Cook's explored there during the war, a member of his crew is a guy named William Bligh. Ever heard of William Bligh? The reason you know about William Bligh, of course, is all those movies they made about him, the Mutiny on the Bounty. And here's how I connect it to the American Revolution. After all of Cook's explorations, Bligh is back in England, and Joseph Banks, a naturalist who'd been with Cook at Tahiti, he wants the British government to send an expedition back to Tahiti to get a plant that he discovered in Tahiti called the breadfruit. And the reason they want to get the breadfruit is because it's really cheap, it grows really well, and it's a food source. And why do they want a cheap food source? During the American Revolution, there was a food shortage in the West Indies. Slaves were dying because they weren't getting enough food, so they want to ship breadfruit from Tahiti to Jamaica so they can have a cheap source of food for slaves. So Bligh gets sent out, and as you know, his crew mutinies. They throw all the breadfruit plants away. Bligh actually has to go by open boat all the way to East Timor, north of Australia. He eventually makes his way back to England, and the English government and Joseph Banks send him out again. So he makes his second trip in 1791, gets all the way to Tahiti. He brings back 2,126 breadfruit plants, gets them to Jamaica, and the slaves don't like to eat it. Traveling a little bit further west, or east and north, you come to Hawaii. The one claim to fame for Hawaii is during Captain Cook's last expedition, when he makes a return visit to Hawaii after discovering it. The natives aren't really pleased, and he does. Introduced another American traveler there, a guy named John Ledyard. Ledyard's a sort of interesting guy. He was born in Connecticut. He went to Dartmouth. He dropped out of Dartmouth because he liked to travel. He actually rowed a canoe from all the way down the Connecticut River to Long Island Sound. Then he decides he wants to become a sailor, so he gets himself on a merchant ship. He ends up in England, and when he's walking around the docks in England, the British press gang grabs him, drags him off, and he becomes a Marine in the British Navy. And he's on Captain Cook's third expedition. So he's in Hawaii when Cook's in Hawaii. Afterwards, he didn't get killed, so he ends up back in England. And then, as a sailor or a Marine in the British Navy, he gets sent off to the war now. He gets sent off to Canada. So here you've got this guy from Connecticut who's supposed to be fighting Americans. He doesn't like that, so he deserts. Makes his way back to Dartmouth. He writes a book about his voyages with Cook. And then he gets the travel lust again. He'd been up around the Pacific Northwest and saw how furs were really popular, or abundant, I should say, up there. And he knows the Chinese want that. So he decides to take another trip after talking with Thomas Jefferson. He attempts to travel from France all the way across Russia. Then his idea is he's going to cross over to Alaska, make his way down across America, and end up in Virginia. Now you've all heard of that trip, right? He doesn't make it. He gets most of his way across Russia, then he gets arrested by the Russians. Catherine the Great deports him, and he has to go back to France. But his wanderlust doesn't end. He joins another group that decides they're going to go from the Red Sea all the way across northern Africa to the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, he catches an illness and he dies, and he's buried in Cairo, right along the Nile. So a guy from Connecticut does a lot of travel. Moving along. Where are we now? Good. Just want to make sure everybody's awake. I have a tendency to make people fall asleep. South America. Eastern South America is controlled by the Portuguese. That would be what we call Brazil today. Western and most of South America is Spanish. Way up on the northern part of South America, the British, the Dutch, and the French have trading outposts. Spanish South America, of course, is big in trading gold and silver, diamonds, wood, and coffee. And there's a big effect in the American Revolution here. And this is something Rich wanted. Ages ago when Rich wanted me to do this program, he wanted me to show revolutions everywhere. And so far we really haven't found any. But now, here Rich gets what he wants. Here's where the revolutions are. In South America, during the American Revolution, there were 4 different revolutions that break out. One breaks out in what we today would call Argentina, another one in southern Peru, one in Bolivia, one in Colombia, and parts of Venezuela. So pretty much all of Spanish South America is revolting at different times. The revolts you can relate to the American Revolution. The Spanish government was trying to reform things, as far as they thought they were reforms. They were streamlining the government, but it was basically establishing the Spanish as the ones who rule, and they were taking out any of the mixed races or any of the Indians. They were being discriminated against. And they're increasing taxes to help pay for the war. So that's why all these revolts break out. Some of them are really big and really violent, but they all end up, unfortunately for the revolutionaries, as losses. The Spanish maintain control, but it sets the precedence for revolutions that will take place later on the next century. In northern South America, which of course is part of the Caribbean Sea, there are outposts again for trading. The British, when the Dutch get in the war, go in and capture 3 Dutch outposts, and then a year later the French come and capture them back and give them back to the Dutch. Portugal, the Portuguese South America, Brazil, they have a revolution too for Rich. This is probably one he'd really like. It's after the American Revolution. It's in 1789, but in this case it's Brazilian middle class, Brazilian educated people who were influenced by the French philosophers. They were influenced by the American Revolution, and they revolt over rising taxes because the gold mining was declining. But of course their revolution is suppressed as well, and the leaders are all executed. So, on that happy note, we'll move along. So there's your revolution. Central America was pretty much all Spanish, but the British had a few outposts where they were harvesting logwood and they're growing sugar. And when the war breaks out between England and the Spanish, they raid each other's territory back and forth. The most interesting thing that occurs would be in Nicaragua. Nicaragua had a river called the San Juan that connected with Lake Nicaragua, which then there was only a small landmass to get you to the Pacific Ocean. So all these Europeans are like, this would be a great place for a canal. a northwest passage to connect the two. So the English actually send an expedition out of Jamaica. They capture the coastal fort. They work their way up the San Juan River. Oh, by the way, the commander of the naval expedition for this part, for the English, is a guy named Horatio Nelson. You'll hear about him later on in history. As they're going up, though, of course, what do they encounter in these nice jungle areas? Malaria, yellow fever, and the army is being decimated by disease. The commander of the land forces succumbs to disease, and the second in command has to take over, a guy named Stephen Kimball. For those of you who aren't familiar with, Stephen Kimball's dad lived in Jockey Hollow. His name was Peter Kimball. And Stephen takes over, but his troops are so decimated they withdraw back to Jamaica, and all is lost in terms of Nicaragua for the British. Then we move on to the West Indies. The West Indies are really important to all the European powers because they produce sugar, which makes them a lot of money. At the end of the French and Indian War, the French actually give all of Canada to the English so they can get back one or two islands that produce sugar. When the war breaks out, a lot of people always ask, why doesn't Jamaica and all these other islands join the Americans in revolt? And there's some reasons for that. Basic reason is they're islands. They're easily attacked by any nation with a navy. The British have the biggest navy in the world. They also want the British forces to help them to help suppress slave revolts. In a lot of these islands, the slaves are actually the majority of the population. So they want that British support. But the war causes a lot of problems for the British islands in the West Indies. First thing that's happened, they've lost American markets. They've lost American ships that move their stuff. One of the biggest things is they've lost a source of food and lumber. They spend so much land growing sugar, they don't grow enough crops. And there are shortages of food, which is why we get the breadfruit later on. In Jamaica, there's actually a slave revolt over a lack of food. Slaves were really smart too. They found out British troops were leaving Jamaica to head up to New England to help with the war, so that's when they revolt. The revolt lasts for several days until the British can stop it all. So we've got slave revolts and all sorts of problems there. And of course, early in the war, the Americans look on this as a great place to attack because they want to get supplies. So 1775, the Americans go north of our map here, they go to Bermuda. And when they get there, they want gunpowder. And there's actually a deal worked out. Some of the people in Bermuda actually support the American cause. They're American sympathizers. But the Americans have what the Bermuda people want. The Americans have food. They're running short. So the American sympathizers actually get a hold of 100 kegs of gunpowder, and they trade it with the Americans, and then the Americans allowed food to be traded in Bermuda until later on the English stopped that. Then the Bahamas are raided. It's America's first planned naval operation. That's where the Marines, for the first time, land on enemy shores. And they were again looking for gunpowder. Unfortunately, the British sort of had an inkling that the Americans were coming. So most of the gunpowder was actually shipped out to St. Augustine before the Americans get here. One of the interesting things I found out, if any of you ever go to Williamsburg, they always talk about Lord Dunmore taking the gunpowder. The gunpowder that Lord Dunmore took got shipped to the Bahamas, and then gets shipped out of the Bahamas to St. Augustine before the Americans get it. But in their raid, the Americans managed to capture 71 cannons and over 24 casks of gunpowder. But once France and Holland and Spain get the war, they're fighting all over these islands, taking one from the other, getting them back again, and it's way too convoluted and confusing to explain. But I'm going to talk about one island, that's St. Eustatius, that's a Dutch island. This was a free port. They allowed any country to trade there. So there were English merchants there, French merchants, Dutch merchants, Jewish merchants, and it was a major conduit for supplies to be sent to America by these privateers who come down and ship it up. So it's a real annoyance to the British, especially when a U.S. Navy ship goes into St. Eustatius and the governor feels obligated to salute the Americans. The American ship coming in fired their cannons as a salute, which was a courtesy. And the Dutch actually fire a salute back. So in essence, they're recognizing the United States, which really, really annoyed the British. And the governor of St. Eustatius at the time actually has a connection to our park, but I don't think they're related. The guy's name was de Graaf. We have a ranger named de Graaf here. Just trivia, nothing to do with anything. Eventually, when war breaks out between Holland and England, remember we talked about who gets the news first? The Dutch and Stations had no idea. Admiral Rodney, a British admiral, comes down. The Dutch give out without a fight because they didn't even know there was a war at that point, so a war with them anyway. So they were unprepared, so they surrendered without a fight. And Rodney takes advantage of the situation. Rodney had a lot of debts in England, and he starts plundering St. Eustatius. He confiscates basically everything that's there, private property or public property. He, for some reason, really doesn't seem to like Jewish people, so he deports every Jew on the island off, along with Governor de Graaf. He confiscates all their stuff, he burns their synagogue and all their buildings, and he takes everybody else's stuff. There was one poor American there who was a loyalist. He'd been beaten up by the Americans 2 different times and lost all his property, so he goes to St. Eustatius to escape. And Rodney takes all his stuff too. There is one happy note though. Rodney puts most of the stuff on a boat and sends it back to England, and the French capture the boat. Eventually the French take the island back again. And this capture, Rodney spent a good deal of time there. It was controversial because he could have been doing other things, and he allowed a French fleet to come in, which eventually would go fight at Yorktown. Yeah, time is running out, so we must go quickly along our trail. Louisiana. Louisiana had been French, but the French felt bad after the French and Indian War, so they give it over to the Spanish. And the governor of Louisiana, a man named Galvez, that's where you get Galveston, Texas from today, he was incredibly active when the Spanish get into the war. He goes up the Mississippi, he captures Baton Rouge, he captures Natchez, he goes out to the Gulf, he captures Mobile. Later on, he captures Pensacola. The British don't want to be outdone though, so they make small movements as well. From the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, they send a force down, mostly of Indians. They attack St. Louis, Missouri, and Cahokia, Illinois, which was defended by George Rogers Clark. But both the Spanish and the Americans managed to drive the enemy away. The Spanish get mad, so then they go up and they attack Fort St. Joseph, which is in Niles, Michigan. They go in, capture it, run their flag up, they leave the next day. But they thought if there were negotiations over territory, they could claim that because they had actually captured it. And the Spanish are actually involved in the last engagement of the war. Of course, it depends on what town you live in, which claims which is the last engagement. But the English actually attack a place called Arkansas Post in Arkansas. They attempt to capture the fort, but the Spanish drive them off. And lots of other places to go. We have Texas. Believe it or not, Texas was involved in the war. Texas didn't have a whole lot going on in there, but they raised a lot of cattle, and Galvez needed supplies. So the first known cattle drive in Texas was cattle being shipped from Texas to Louisiana to feed Galvez's troops. All the Spanish territories, Texas, what now would be Arizona, New Mexico, they all contributed to the war from attacks. The Spanish king asks all the American or Spanish-American colonies to provide money for the war. He asks that each Indian give 1 peso and each Spaniard give 2 pesos. And they collect money, and that money eventually is collected and actually helps, goes to Havana and helps send the French ships when they come up to Yorktown. Way up there in Alaska. Cook is exploring up there. The Spanish are really afraid of that because that's their territory they claim. They're also afraid the Russians are coming down. So it's sort of interesting. While Cook is exploring, Benjamin Franklin actually sent out a notice saying, Cook's doing good work for the greater humanity, so he asks all American ships not to bother Cook. The Spanish, in turn, want to capture Cook. So they have orders to capture him, but they miss him by about a year, so he gets away. One of the really weird things I heard about, way up there in Hudson's Bay, the French actually send ships up there during the war, and they burned 3 outposts of the Hudson's Bay Company. So we're all the way up there. Of course, lots of fighting in Quebec. And you're all familiar with those wars. I found out there's lots of fighting in the Maritimes. What now would be New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Maine. There's a lot of raids back and forth. Over here in the small corner, Newfoundland, there's 2 tiny, tiny islands south of there that had been given to the French after the French and Indian War. The British go and capture them during the American Revolution, and they deport all the French people. But then the French get it back, and it's still French today. Then we've got all the Native Americans in there. The Native Americans mostly side with the British because they can get a better deal with them in terms of trade. And the British had tried to stop the Americans from expanding into their territory. Then we cross the Atlantic, get back to England again. There's fighting in England too. There was a man named John the Painter. He was a criminal, he was Scottish. He talked to Silas Deane in France, gets some money from him, and he goes into England and he actually sets up incendiary bombs in 2 of the British naval dockyards. And they cause some fires and it spreads panic all through England. So when you think about terrorists, he's one of the earliest ones. He does get caught though and he's executed. John Paul Jones, of course, does lots of raiding all around Great Britain. He even lands in Scotland. And then one of the odd ones I've never really heard of before is in the Channels, the Isle of Jersey had been English, and it was a source of privateers raiding. So the French actually invade the island of Jersey. And they actually have an Indian prince as one of their officers. But they're not well organized and they lose the battle. So eventually, we go back to Europe, and we go to the Treaty of Paris. Another painting done by Benjamin West, and as you can see it's not finished. It's because the British Peace Commissioners didn't want to be painted. They were sort of bitter, I guess. So what are the end results? Independence for the United States. They gained some land, they gained fishing rights. Great Britain, they lose the 13 colonies. They lose East and West Florida, they lose some land in the Caribbean. The French, they get revenge against England. There's some trading of land for them. The end result for them, though, is big financial trouble. They have huge debts, which will cause trouble in their country later on. Spain, they didn't get their biggest thing. They didn't get Gibraltar. But they do get more territory. They get East and West Florida back again. Dutch basically gained very little from the whole thing. So, come to conclusion, remember, taxes, trade, territory, revenge, self-interest. But one of my favorite lines from Justin for interpretive talks is the so what factor. You know, we talked all about this stuff. A lot of you are very patient, some of you are falling asleep. So what? You've invested all this time. What's the most important thing in this whole talk? The most important thing is, we always think we win the war because we're so great, and we are. But we wouldn't have won the war unless it became a world war. The guns we're firing for a lot of the war are French, some are Spanish, some are Dutch. The powder in all our guns is probably French powder. A lot of the officers who are in our army, training them, especially the ones who are skilled in artillery and engineering, are French or other foreign officers. The uniforms sometimes were French. Another big thing is just foreign distractions. Now they're fighting all over the world. Like, remember when the British captured Philadelphia, the capital? They thought the war would end. They leave Philadelphia within a year. Why did they leave? Because they wanted to take troops out of North America and send them to defend the West Indies. So all these other distractions make things a little bit easier for us. It also helped that in England it wasn't a popular war. It was the war of the Tory party. The Whig party was against it. And what it basically comes down to is the war becomes too big, and it becomes too expensive, and the British just want to cut their losses. And that's why the World War is so important. But before I end, I just threw in one final last thing. I'm a storyteller, so I've got a story for you too. This story comes from India, and it's about 6 blind men. There were 6 blind men, and they heard everybody talk about an elephant, but they'd never seen an elephant. They never experienced an elephant. They heard there was this wealthy man who had an elephant. So they go to him and they say, "We want to see your elephant." He's like, "You're blind? You want to see my elephant?" But he brings the elephant out. And as you can see in this Chinese statue, they all go up to the elephant. One man feels the side of the elephant. He goes, "The elephant is a wall." Another one feels his leg. He goes, "No, the elephant is a tree trunk." One feels the tail. He says, "Oh no, it's a rope." One feels the spear, or the tusk. He goes, "Oh, it's a spear." One feels the wind from the flapping of the ear. He goes, "Oh no, it's a fan." And one touches the trunk and it starts swirling around. "Oh no, it's a snake." And then they all debate back, "No, it's this, no, it's that." They all start yelling at each other, describing a fight. Finally, the wealthy man comes out and he calms them. He goes, "No, no, no, you're all right, but you're all wrong. You have to put it all together. You've all seen it from your own perspective, but if you put it all together, hopefully tonight you've seen the whole elephant. Thank you.
Forward to his talk, and I don't think he disappointed us. No, what a great history lesson. Do we have time for questions? Sure. Okay. Questions?
What do you think of the controversy surrounding Aaron Burr with the Spanish influence?
I'm afraid I don't know enough to comment. I know a lot about little tiny things, but some big things I don't know. So I wouldn't even attempt to do it. Now you're all disappointed. It's a big, if you're really into it, there's actually only one book that was ever really written on this whole thing, and it's called The American Revolution and Global War. It was printed in the 1970s. There's a lot of other tiny books that deal with certain specifics. There's one whole thing just about the British and the West Indies. There's one about the Spanish. Believe it or not, Wikipedia has a lot of stuff in it. You just have to be really specific, and then they give you tons of stuff. That's how I found out originally about Hudson's Bay, because it popped up in Wikipedia. It's a really cool story.
Aside from Washington, who was the second most influential and accomplished general?
That all depends on what state you live in. Most people love General Greene. They think he was probably the best. Then you get into people who love Benedict Arnold and people who hate Benedict Arnold. And then there's a lot of generals that don't amount to much. There's an interesting thing after when the quasi-war with France was developing. I found in a book, Washington actually wrote a paper where he wrote out what he thought of all the generals who were still around to see who might take over the reins of command. And it's sort of interesting. He uses sober most of the time. But it's probably, in my opinion, Greene. He's probably the next best.
You mentioned there was 4 revolutions in South America. Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela is 2.
Peru.
And what's the other 2?
Peru, Colombia, Venezuela is one together.
Yeah.
Bolivia, Argentina. The funny thing is, in one of the revolutions, it's a guy who was of mixed race. He was sort of a local dignitary. He's got some power, but he gets really upset the way everybody's treated. And when the revolution starts, he takes on a new name because he thought he was the last living descendant of the last Inca chieftain. So he takes on the name Tupac, which I was thinking of rap music. And so he has this name Tupac Kamari II, because his ancestor supposedly was one. When the next other revolution breaks out, that guy takes the name Tupac as well, and he takes the name of another revolutionary. So this name Tupac runs through all these different revolutions. But it's complicated stuff.
The Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons that I understand it was written was so that the American people could say to foreign countries, this is what we're doing, this is why we're rebelling. Did it have any effect on some of these countries, like Catherine the Great deciding not to get involved? Could you say that the Declaration really had an effect on that?
I haven't really run across anything that said anything about the Declaration influencing. It's self-interest. They all are looking out for what they want. Catherine wants more influence in Europe. She actually offers to try to mediate a peace, but she's trying to be very strictly neutral. But the Spanish want territory, the French want revenge. Everybody's looking out for themselves. Not too noble. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Now, folks, we have our trivia moment coming up. And I'll introduce a very nice man, Mr. Florsharmer, to do our history.
Admonition before you leave, please return your name tags. death will result if you do not. Okay, this is a tough act to follow. I don't know how to do that. But let's see. These are rather general questions, and let's see how well we do with it. How long did the siege at Yorktown last? Anybody know? How long did it last? No, more like 3. Okay, actually it was 22 days. I thought you said 2 days. Oh, by 1 day, so you were wrong. It lasted from September 28th to October 19th, the year 1781. Very good. Although no reliable figures exist, what is the World Almanac's estimate of the number of actual American battle deaths during the 8.5 years the Revolutionary War lasted? Any idea? Who said? 5,000. Close. The actual number, according to the Almanac, was 4,435 actual battle deaths where people were killed in battle. All right. Now there's some wounded. Any idea how many men were actually wounded but did not die? This is just a guess.
8,000.
No, it's 6,188 according to the Almanac. I don't know, they may be off by 1 or 2. Incidentally, there are no reliable figures of casualties attributed to disease. I couldn't find anything. That's kind of interesting. Of the 11 major wars this country has fought, not including the war in Afghanistan, where do you think the Revolutionary War ranks in number of battle deaths? Actual battle deaths. There weren't very many, but there were some wars where there were more and some fewer. 6. Okay. The most being the Civil War, where there were some 214,000, almost 215,000 battle deaths. And the least being the Persian War, Persian Gulf War, where there were a mere 147 deaths. By what more popular name do we know the Revolutionary War personality named Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier? Lafayette is correct. I didn't think I was going to stump you on that one. Okay. The deadly winter of 1779-1780 was a real dilemma for Loyalists and British-held New York City because of a shortage of one commodity that the American... Bloody finish. The American Army across the river at Jockey Hollow had in abundance. Thank you, Ms. Firewall. Incidentally, New Yorkers were obliged to burn furniture, fences, wood from unoccupied buildings, even ship's hulls. There was one story that I read where a ship was fully loaded at the docks. The New Yorkers came, took the cargo off, took the ship apart and burned it for firewood. They were that desperate for firewood. There were some people who actually died in their beds overnight because they died of the cold. Okay. What is generally considered the American Army's morale low point in war? According to John Cunningham, I'm quoting him, the Jockey Hollow troop mutiny of January 1st, 1781, when troops revolted citing no food, no pay, or even the bare necessities of life for months and even years. We're number one. We're number one. In July 1779, what British general led Loyalist American troops, Loyalists now, in a series of brutal, vengeful raids on the towns along the Connecticut coast? Nope. Tryon, General William Tryon, whose savagery against civilian non-combatants, rebels and Tories alike, including the burning of over 200 homes, farm buildings and businesses, the slaughter of women and children, and the plunder of their food and property, raised probably one of the biggest reactions by the Connecticut people. They made it even Tories, fervent rebels. I'll get it right. What liability in the American Army for presenting an ill-maintained musket during an arms inspection. 30 lashes administered on the spot, according to the manual. And the reduction